The warehouse smelled like diesel fuel and the particular staleness of air that hasn't moved in hours. I'd been working there for 3 weeks, and the smell had stopped bothering me sometime around day 4. Now it was just part of the landscape, the olfactory baseline of my existence from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., 6 nights a week. The smell had become as much a part of me as my own skin, and I suspected that if I ever left this place permanently, the smell would linger on my clothes for weeks afterward, a phantom marker of time spent in spaces that existed primarily to be forgotten. My name is Robert Ransom, and I was 26 years old when I started this job. That detail is less important than it seems, the kind of biographical information you volunteer when you're trying to establish credibility with someone you've just met. Age matters less when you're the kind of person who accepts whatever work appears in front of you without too much questioning. The warehouse work had appeared when I needed it most, which was to say immediately after my last job had ended in the particular way that my jobs always seem to end. Not with drama or confrontation, but with a kind of quiet dissolution, a slow recognition from both sides that the arrangement wasn't working, followed by a polite severance and an abrupt return to the precarious mathematics of unemployment. What I'd wanted my life to be was a different conversation entirely, one I'd stopped having with myself somewhere around age 23, right around the point when I'd understood that the trajectory I'd imagined wasn't going to materialize. The degree in business administration wasn't leading to entry-level positions with growth potential. The networking wasn't working. The job market was a different kind of market than the one that had been described to me in career counseling sessions. And so I'd accepted, gradually without ever making a conscious decision about it, that I was going to be a person who moved from job to job, taking whatever was available, grateful for steady paychecks and health insurance, trying not to think about the shape my life was taking. The warehouse was a logistics facility operated by Titan Freight Solutions. The name itself was a kind of corporate poetry, all flowing sounds and vague promises of movement and connection. In reality, it was a massive structure in an industrial park in northern New Jersey, roughly the size of 4 football fields, divided into numbered bays that stretched back into the darkness like the ribs of some enormous animal that had been dead for a very long time. The company handled overflow inventory for retail chains across the Northeast. Merchandise came in on trucks, got sorted by barcode and destination, and left on different trucks going to different places. It was work that required precision and speed, and the ability to work alone for long stretches without becoming depressed about the meaninglessness of the endeavor. I was reasonably good at it, in the way that you can be reasonably good at something without actually caring whether you do it well or poorly. The work existed in a space beyond personal investment. It was simply what I did between the hours of 8 p.m. and 4 a.m., and those hours paid for my apartment and my food, and the various small expenses that kept me functioning as a member of society. My job title was Night Inventory Specialist, which sounded more impressive than it actually was. What it meant, in practical terms, was that I was responsible for conducting periodic checks of the stored inventory, confirming that what the system said should be there actually was there. I had a handheld scanner, a clipboard, and a route that took me through the facility on a schedule established by the logistics software. The route was designed to ensure that every bay was checked at least once during my shift, with certain priority bays checked more frequently based on turnover rates and value assessments. Bay 4 was a priority bay, apparently. According to my schedule, I was supposed to check it at midnight, 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Every night, 3 times, like clockwork. My route would direct me to that particular bay to scan barcodes and confirm inventory against the digital records maintained by the company's systems. It was the kind of routine that should have become automatic after the first few days, a task executed with minimal conscious thought. But there was a note in my training materials. Handwritten, not printed on a post-it stuck to the edge of my route sheet, the note said, "Do not check Bay 4 after 2 a.m. This is mandatory. Do not make exceptions." The note was signed with initials I didn't recognize. When I'd asked my supervisor about it during training, a man named Frank who seemed to regard the entire training process as a personal inconvenience, he'd looked at it briefly and then looked back at his computer with the kind of disinterest that suggested he'd already said everything he was going to say on the subject. "Just follow it," Frank had finally offered. "Bay 4 gets checked at midnight and 1 a.m. Skip the 3 a.m. check. That's fine. The inventory in that bay doesn't move much anyway." "Why?" I'd asked. "What's in Bay 4 that makes it different from the others?" He'd sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested this was a question he'd answered before and had hoped never to answer again. "Returned merchandise, I think. Stuff that's being processed for reshipment or destruction. High-value returns, priority processing. That's why the frequency is higher. But it doesn't need to be checked after 2 a.m. The processing happens during business hours. Once we close down the day operations, that bay gets locked down. Item retention is stable overnight. You don't need to disturb it." The explanation had been casual enough that I'd accepted it without further questions. That was my pattern, developed over years of moving between jobs and trying not to make myself a problem for management. Accept, integrate, move forward. Ask why later if it became relevant, which it usually didn't. But 3 weeks in, working the graveyard shift, cycling through the same route 6 nights a week, I was starting to wonder. The thing about working alone in a warehouse from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. is that it creates a particular quality of consciousness. You exist in a state of semi-awareness, your mind partially engaged with the task at hand, partially drifting. The repetition of the work becomes almost meditative. Scan barcode, check product against digital record, mark inventory as confirmed, move to next location, scan barcode, check product, mark inventory, over and over, through bays numbered 1 through 47, the progression feeling less like work and more like the execution of some complex ritual that had meaning only if you didn't think too carefully about it. And 3 times a night, like a meditation within the meditation, you would arrive at Bay 4 and you would avoid checking it after 2 a.m. I'd started to notice other things. The root software that generated my schedule would occasionally suggest a check of Bay 4 at 2:15 a.m. or 2:47 a.m. or 3:23 a.m., times that were clearly after the 2 a.m. cutoff. When this happened, the system would flag the suggested check in red and label it not recommended. The software itself seemed to understand, through some internal logic that I couldn't quite parse, that Bay 4 after 2 a.m. was a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. There was no error message, no system warning explaining the flagged status. Just the red highlight in the 2 words, as though the software was gently suggesting that I might want to reconsider. But the software didn't explain why. What I'd observed about Bay 4, through my twice-nightly pre-2 a.m. checks, was that it seemed to operate according to different rules than the other bays. Most bays contained merchandise that was relatively static. Boxes of returned clothing, shrink-wrapped and organized by size and color. Defective electronics waiting for processing, their boxes marked with cryptic damage assessments. Damaged goods, furniture with broken legs or water damage, items destined for either refurbishment or destruction. The inventory in those bays changed slowly, requiring updates every week or 2 as the merchandise was routed to its final destination. Bay 4, by contrast, seemed to require constant attention. Every time I checked it, which was twice a night, always before 2 a.m., always before that mysterious threshold, the inventory numbers had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger alerts in the system, but noticeably enough that I'd learned to really look at the contents carefully. Things that had been there the previous night were gone. New items had appeared. The organization of the merchandise had shifted, boxes rearranged, containers moved to different shelves. It was as though Bay 4 was in constant flux, as though something in that space was actively changing, sorting, reorganizing the merchandise according to some system I didn't understand. I'd asked Frank, my supervisor, about it one morning when I'd caught him before he left. It was around 4:30 a.m., the tail end of his shift, the beginning of my approach to the end of my own. I'd found him in the office doing paperwork that seemed to involve a lot of clicking and sighing. Bay 4 turns over a lot, I'd said, trying to make it sound casual. The way you do when you're asking a question you suspect might have an answer that makes people uncomfortable. Every time I check it, the inventory is different. More different than any other bay. I'm wondering if there's something specific I should be aware of. Frank had paused, his hand hovering over his keyboard. He'd looked at me for a moment, and I'd seen something in his expression that I'd seen before in the faces of people who were trying to decide how much to tell me. It was a calculation, a weighing of variables, a decision point between professional responsibility and personal convenience. Bay 4 is special inventory, he'd finally said, the words coming slowly, as though he was considering each one before allowing it to leave his mouth. Items that are high-priority returns, things that require accelerated processing. They get moved through the system quickly, routed out ASAP. That's why the turnover is high. You're not seeing anything unusual. It's just the nature of that particular bay. Then why the rule about not checking it after 2 a.m.? I'd pressed. If it's just about turnover, why is that specific time important? He'd looked at me longer this time, and I'd realized that I'd probably asked one question too many. His expression had shifted from calculation to something more like resignation. The look of someone who'd hoped not to have this conversation, but had realized that avoidance wasn't going to be an option. Because after 2 a.m., the processing stops and the bay is sealed, he'd said carefully, choosing words like someone defusing a bomb. Whatever's in there at night is left alone until the next day. The company policy is to not disturb Bay 4 during those hours. It's about maintaining the integrity of the items. Some returns are sensitive to handling. They need to sit undisturbed for a period of time. Temperature-sensitive goods, fragile items, things like that. The company just prefers that we don't open the bay after 2 a.m. It's a procedural thing. Nothing to worry about. It had been a reasonable explanation. It had the ring of institutional truth, the kind of explanation that gets written into employee handbooks and procedure manuals, the kind of thing that sounds plausible until you think about it too carefully and realize that nothing about it actually makes sense. Why would the company care whether a return was disturbed at 2 a.m. specifically? Why not a different time? Why was the cutoff so precise? But I'd nodded, accepted the explanation, and tried to move on. That was my pattern. Accept, integrate, don't push back. I had a job, the job paid. The job required that I not ask too many questions about why things were the way they were. What I'd noticed, though, was that Frank's explanation didn't match what the software was telling me. The software suggested frequent checks of Bay 4. The system seemed to want eyes on that bay at all hours, regardless of the time. It was only the handwritten note that prevented me from conducting those checks after 2 a.m. The note was a human override, a deliberate contradiction of the automated system. Someone had physically written that note and attached it to my route sheet. And that someone had known that I would see it and obey it more readily than I would obey the software's algorithmic suggestions. And the more I thought about that contradiction, the more I thought about it, the more curious I became. Not the healthy kind of curiosity, the kind that leads to learning and understanding, but the obsessive kind, the kind that spirals, the kind that makes you think about something until thinking about it becomes a compulsion. 3 weeks and 4 days into the job, in the early morning hours of a Thursday, at a time when my concentration was at its lowest, and my ability to make good decisions had been eroded by the particular exhaustion of night shift work, I made a decision that I knew was probably a mistake, but I was going to make it anyway. I was going to violate the rule. It was 2:17 a.m. I'd completed my checks of bays 1 through 3. My route had just suggested a check of Bay 4. The system had flagged it in red, not recommended. The time was well past the 2 a.m. cutoff. Everything in my training, everything in that handwritten note, everything in the procedure manual told me that I should skip this check and move on to the remaining bays. But I found myself standing at the entrance to Bay 4, looking at the heavy sliding door that separated it from the main warehouse floor. And I'd been thinking about the contradiction between the software and the note. One of them had to be wrong about something, or one of them was protecting something from the other, and I wanted to know which. I'd swiped my badge and the door had slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Bay 4 was smaller than the other bays, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, with high shelving on 3 walls. The ceiling was lower than in the rest of the warehouse, I noticed, almost immediately lower. That detail bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It was as though the space had been deliberately compressed, as though something had been done to the architecture to make the bay feel smaller than it actually was. The merchandise was stacked in a particular way, neat and organized, much more carefully arranged than in the other bays. The items themselves were harder to categorize than the typical returns. Some of it looked like ordinary merchandise, clothing, electronics, household goods, the kind of things you'd expect to find in a returns processing center. But some of it was stranger. There were items I didn't immediately recognize, objects that seemed to serve no obvious purpose, containers of various sizes, some labeled with barcodes, some not labeled at all. Some of the containers had warning labels in languages I didn't recognize. The air in Bay 4 was different from the rest of the warehouse. It was colder, for one thing, noticeably colder, as though the climate control in that bay had been set to a different temperature than the rest of the facility. And there was a smell, faint but distinct, something like ozone and something else, something organic, something I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of smell that made your nervous system register a warning without your conscious mind being able to articulate what the warning was supposed to mean. I'd walked deeper into the bay, my scanner in hand, trying to make sense of the inventory. I'd been trying to establish a routine, to fall back on the familiar pattern of scan barcode, check item, mark inventory. But my hands were shaking slightly, and it took me a moment to realize that I was nervous, genuinely nervous, with no clear external threat to justify the nervousness. The inventory had been mostly accurate, matching what the software said should be there. But there were items in the bay that weren't in the system at all. Items without barcodes. Items that seemed to exist outside the normal tracking process, as though they existed in some separate category that the company's logistics software wasn't designed to handle. I'd been so focused on trying to scan these items, trying to understand how to enter them into the system, that I'd almost missed the sound. It had been subtle, almost below the threshold of hearing, a kind of rustling, as though something was moving among the boxes on the higher shelves. It was the kind of sound you might have made if you'd shifted your weight while crouching in a confined space, or moved a piece of paper across a surface. Small, almost insignificant, but it had made every muscle in my body tense. I'd looked up, shining my handheld light toward the source of the sound. But I'd seen nothing, just boxes, neatly stacked, sitting in the warehouse cold, completely static. The light had played across the metal shelves, creating shadows that danced and shifted, but there was no visible movement. No indication that anything had changed since I'd entered the bay. I'd continued scanning, trying to ignore the sound, trying to pretend that I hadn't heard it, that my nervous system hadn't registered something that my rational mind couldn't immediately explain. But the sound continued, the rustling becoming slightly more pronounced, as though whatever was making it was becoming less concerned about remaining quiet, as though it had realized that I was aware of its presence and was no longer bothering with stealth. That was when I'd heard the first word. It hadn't been loud. It had barely been audible. But it had been distinct. A single syllable, something like no, but stretched out, extended as though it was being spoken by something with very different anatomy than a human throat. The word had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, resonating through the bay in a way that suggested it was being produced by the space itself rather than by anything occupying the space. I'd stopped scanning. I'd set down my handheld device on the nearest shelf with shaking hands. I'd looked up more carefully this time, trying to locate the source of the sound, and for just a moment, for a fraction of a second that was long enough to register, but short enough to be dismissed as a trick of the light, I'd seen something. A shape, moving among the boxes on the highest shelf. Something that was too large to be among those boxes without displacing them. Something that was moving with too many limbs to be anything I could immediately identify. The shape had been vaguely humanoid, or perhaps I'd been trying to impose a humanoid template on something that had no relationship to human morphology at all. What I'd perceived in that brief moment was something that existed in a number of dimensions slightly different from the ones my eyes were designed to process. Something that looked wrong. Something that looked impossible. I'd dropped my scanner. The clatter had echoed through Bay 4, the sound of the device hitting the concrete floor, bouncing, coming to rest. The sound had been loud in the silence of the warehouse, a sound that violated the careful order I'd been maintaining. The shape had paused in its movement. I'd felt a kind of attention focus on me, a sense of awareness that was entirely different from any human attention I'd ever experienced. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it was real. It was present. It was noticing that I was there. And in that moment, I'd understood, with a clarity that bypassed rational analysis, that I'd made a terrible mistake. I turned and walked out of Bay 4, not running, because running felt like it would make things worse, but walking quickly, with purpose, with the gait of someone who's just remembered an appointment somewhere else. I'd swiped my badge at the exit, the door had slid closed behind me, and I'd stood in the main warehouse floor, shaking, trying to process what I'd just experienced. I'd tried to convince myself that I'd seen something ordinary. A rat, maybe. A bird that had gotten into the warehouse. Some combination of shadows and exhaustion creating the illusion of something larger, something more complex than anything that could reasonably exist in a logistics facility in New Jersey. But I'd known, with a certainty that went beyond rational explanation, beyond the normal ways that evidence builds an understanding, that I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The rest of my shift had passed in a state of hyper-awareness. I'd completed my remaining checks, avoiding Bay 4 entirely, avoiding even looking in the direction of that bay. I'd done the math in my head and realized that I still had over 5 hours of shift left. 5 hours of being alone in a warehouse with something that had moved with too many limbs and spoken in a voice that had bypassed my ears and gone directly to my nervous system. 5 hours of time that stretched out before me like an eternity. I'd made it through to 4 a.m., clocking out with hands that were still shaking and walking to my car on legs that felt uncertain about their basic function. I'd driven home on autopilot, my mind stuck on the image of that shape, the sound of that voice, the sensation of being truly noticed by something that had no context for what I was. By the time I'd arrived at my apartment, I'd started to rationalize. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. The warehouse was unsettling, designed to be unsettling, all concrete and metal and vast empty spaces. My mind could have created the experience out of stress and darkness and the particular exhaustion of night shift work. It wasn't necessarily real, but I knew it was real. The next morning, fighting sleep, knowing that I needed to sleep but being unable to, I'd called my supervisor Frank and asked to meet with him. We'd met at a coffee shop near the warehouse around 9 a.m. He'd looked tired, the way supervisors always look when they're being asked to address something they've been hoping wouldn't require addressing. He'd ordered black coffee without cream or sugar, the drink of someone who was using caffeine as a tool rather than looking for something to enjoy. What was in Bay 4 last night? I'd asked directly, not bothering with preamble. There's something in there, something that isn't merchandise. Frank had looked at his coffee for a long moment before responding. His hands had wrapped around the cup, and I'd noticed that they were also shaking slightly. Did you check Bay 4 after 2 a.m.? He'd finally asked. Yes, I'd said. And I need to know what I saw. He'd sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested he'd had this conversation before, with previous night shift employees, with people who'd ignored the rule and paid the price of curiosity. He'd sipped his coffee slowly, and I'd had the sense that he was deciding how much truth he could share without creating liability for the company. What you saw was something that the company prefers we don't discuss, he'd said carefully. What you saw is why there's a rule about checking that bay after 2 a.m., and what you saw is exactly the reason you shouldn't have gone in there. That's not an answer, I'd said. No, he'd agreed. It's not. But it's the only answer you're going to get from me, because if I tell you what's actually in Bay 4, I'll be creating a liability for the company, and I like my job more than I like satisfying your curiosity. He'd stood up to leave and I'd grabbed his arm. People should know what's in their workplace, I'd said. It's not safe to have something like that in a warehouse without staff being informed. He'd pulled his arm away gently but firmly, and I'd felt the strength in the movement. The sense that he was used to pulling away from people who didn't want to let go. Robert, I'm going to give you some advice, he'd said, and I'd been struck by the fact that he'd used my first name, which he never did. It suggested that this advice was personal, that he was stepping outside his professional role. You're going to listen to the note. You're going to skip Bay 4 after 2 a.m. You're going to do your job, collect your paycheck, and you're going to stop thinking about what's in that bay. Because the more you think about it, the more you're going to want to go back in there and figure it out. And the second time you go in there, it's going to notice you properly. And that's when things get complicated. It already noticed me, I'd said. No, Frank had said with certainty. It acknowledged your presence. That's different. Acknowledgement is a warning. Notice is something much less pleasant. He'd left after that, and I'd been alone in the coffee shop with my untouched coffee and the growing realization that I'd stumbled into something that extended far beyond the simple logistics of a warehouse operation. There was a system in place, rules and protocols, training materials and post-it notes, all designed to ensure that the boundary between what was in Bay 4 and what was in the rest of the warehouse was maintained. And I'd violated that boundary. The rest of the day had been spent in a state of anxious deliberation. I could quit. I could walk away from the job, lose the steady income, go back to the precarious scrambling that had defined my employment history. Go back to moving between positions, back to the uncertainty, back to the feeling that my life was a series of failed attempts to find stability. Or I could follow the rule, avoid Bay 4 after 2 a.m., and accept that I worked in a place where something inexplicable existed but wasn't my concern. I could take the money and pretend that I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I could rationalize it as hallucination, as stress, as the inevitable consequence of working alone in the dark for 8 hours a night. By 8 p.m., when I'd shown up for my shift, I'd made my decision. I was going to follow the rule, but I was going to understand it. My plan was simple, or at least it had seemed simple in the abstract, before I'd started executing it. I would use my lunch break, a 30-minute period around midnight, to research Bay 4 more thoroughly. The warehouse had a small office area with a computer system. Theoretically, I should have access to inventory records and historical data. If I could find documentation about what Bay 4 contained, what it had contained in the past, what systems were in place to maintain it, I might be able to understand what I'd seen without having to go back into that space. At midnight, I'd clocked out for my break and went into the office. The office itself was a study in corporate pragmatism, decorated with the kind of furniture that was designed to serve a function rather than create an aesthetic. Metal desks, plastic chairs, filing cabinets, a printer that seemed to be perpetually jammed. The computer system was password protected, but the password for the night shift staff was written on a post-it note stuck to the monitor. The company's security practices were apparently as casual as everything else about this place, as though they'd accepted that actual security measures would be too much effort for a facility that primarily handled merchandise that was already slightly broken or out of fashion. I'd logged in and navigated to the inventory database. The system was clunky, clearly designed decades ago and updated just enough to remain functional, but it contained records, and those records could be searched. Bay 4's record had been interesting. According to the system, it had been a dedicated bay for approximately 8 years. Before that, it had been used for standard returns processing, just like all the other bays. The change in designation had happened abruptly, marked by a note from corporate. Bay 4, now dedicated to special processing, access restricted, maintain sealed environment. The note had been dated 8 years, 3 months ago. The shift from standard to special had been sudden, unannounced, apparently decided at a level of corporate hierarchy that didn't bother to explain itself to warehouse staff. I'd tried to find more details, searching through archived records and historical data, but most of the documentation had been either archived or deleted. What remained were scattered references to special inventory and sealed processing protocols, and repeated reminders that Bay 4 was not to be disturbed during the night shift. The repetition of those reminders was interesting. They'd been issued at regular intervals, roughly twice a year, as though the company felt the need to reinforce the rule to ensure that new staff understood the boundary. There was one file labeled Bay 4 Incident Report, 2019. The file name itself had suggested that something had happened, that there had been an incident significant enough to warrant documentation. I'd clicked on it, hoping to find details, but the file had been corrupted or deleted. All that remained was the title and a date and a blank space where the content had been. I'd tried searching for anything about the 2019 incident, looking through personnel records and incident logs and corporate memos, but all references to it had been scrubbed from the system. It was as though someone had gone through and systematically removed any trace of what had happened. What I had discovered, though, was that Bay 4 had a separate climate control system. It maintained a temperature significantly colder than the rest of the warehouse, 52 degrees, according to the specifications, compared to the standard 68 degrees maintained everywhere else. And it had different humidity levels, kept at 35% while the rest of the warehouse ran at 55%. The bay also had a separate electrical circuit, separate HVAC, separate ventilation. It was essentially isolated from the rest of the facility on a systems level, which meant that whatever was in there, the company had deliberately created an environment for it. They'd designed systems specifically to maintain conditions for whatever Bay 4 housed. That wasn't a side effect of the warehouse design. That was intentional. That was deliberate accommodation. And that realization had changed everything. The company didn't just tolerate whatever was in Bay 4. They weren't accidentally harboring something dangerous in the back of their logistics facility. They'd deliberately designed systems to maintain it. They'd created protocols to avoid disturbing it. They'd issued rules and trained staff not to interact with it. They paid people like me to ensure that that boundary was maintained, which meant they knew exactly what it was. And they had decided that having it here, in this warehouse, was acceptable, that it served some purpose, that it was worth the cost of maintaining the sealed bay, worth the risk of someone eventually discovering what was there. That was the moment when my curiosity shifted into something else. Not just a desire to understand, but a need to know what the company had deemed acceptable enough to keep sealed in a warehouse, what they valued enough to protect with protocols and rules, and carefully maintained silence. The rest of the week had passed with that thought sitting in the back of my mind, growing heavier each day. I'd done my job. I'd completed my inventory checks. I'd religiously skipped Bay 4 after 2 a.m. every night, passing by that bay 3 times every shift, the last check always ending well before the cutoff. I'd never tried to access the bay again. I'd never tried to push beyond the boundary. But I'd been unable to stop thinking about it, about what was in there, about what purpose it served, about why the company had decided that keeping it was worth the cost. By Thursday night, a week after my first violation, I'd made another decision. This time, I wasn't going to go into Bay 4, but I was going to find out what was in it by other means. The warehouse had a security camera system. It was old, analog-based, the kind of system that was probably installed in the 1990s and never upgraded because upgrading would have required someone to actually care about comprehensive security. The cameras fed into a recorder in the main office, a large VCR-like device that seemed incongruous in a modern warehouse. The footage was kept for 30 days before being overwritten by new footage, a cycle of recording and erasure that meant older records were constantly being destroyed. I'd seen the recording system while I was researching the database. It would be relatively simple to access a video of Bay 4's interior to see what actually moved in that space when I wasn't there to witness it. At midnight on Thursday, I'd use my break to access the security system. The system interface was surprisingly intuitive. There was a menu of bays, a calendar for selecting dates, a timeline for selecting specific times. I could pull up any footage from the previous 7 days. I'd selected Bay 4 and chosen Wednesday night, the night before my visit. The footage had been grainy and black and white, the image quality degraded by time and the age of the equipment. But it had been clear enough to see the contents of the bay. I'd watched it in fast forward. The passage of time accelerated, seeing the shelves, the organized merchandise, the sealed containers. The footage had been eerie in its silence, no audio track, just the visual record of a sealed space, apparently untouched, apparently static. For most of the video, nothing had moved. Bay 4 had appeared to be exactly what it appeared to be, a storage bay, sealed and cold and entirely static. Just merchandise waiting for processing, nothing more. Then, at 2:47 a.m., something had changed. The containers on the higher shelves had begun to move. Not dramatically, but noticeably. They'd shifted position as though they were being rearranged by something I couldn't see on the camera. Some of them had been moved from one section to another. Others had been rotated, their orientation changed. The merchandise had been reorganized. Items moved around according to some logic that I couldn't immediately understand. It had taken approximately 20 minutes, a deliberate and methodical rearrangement, and then everything had stopped. By 3:15 a.m., Bay 4 had been static again, all the items in new positions but otherwise untouched. I'd watched the footage twice more, trying to see if there was something I was missing. A building shift causing items to settle, air currents moving boxes, some mechanical system I didn't understand, perhaps equipment that ran on an automated schedule. But I'd known, watching it, that none of those explanations made sense. The movement had been too deliberate, too organized. Something in Bay 4 had deliberately reorganized the merchandise. Something with intention and purpose and the ability to move objects according to a plan. Something was inside that bay every night after 2 a.m., and it was rearranging the merchandise according to criteria that I couldn't begin to guess at. I'd tried to access Friday night's footage, but the recording had been corrupted or overwritten. When I'd tried to access other nights, I'd found similar problems. The security footage for Bay 4 after 2 a.m. had been systematically deleted or damaged, erased from the record as though someone wanted to ensure that no visual evidence of the activity existed. Only that one recording of Wednesday night remained. And I suspected that was only because I'd accessed it before someone realized I was looking. Before someone somewhere in the corporate hierarchy realized that a night shift employee had found his way to the security records and was asking questions. I'd logged out of the system and returned to my shift, my hands shaking with the realization of what I'd found. The company knew what was in Bay 4. They knew what it did. They were monitoring it, recording it, tracking its activity. And they were deliberately keeping that monitoring secret. They were systematically erasing evidence of what happened in that bay after 2 a.m. Which meant that what I'd seen wasn't accidental. What I'd heard wasn't a warning. The thing in Bay 4 was a known entity, something the company had integrated into their operations, something they'd decided was worth protecting and maintaining, something that performed a function. Something that organized merchandise according to criteria that served some purpose in the company's larger operations. The question I couldn't answer was, why? Why keep it? Why maintain it? What purpose did it serve that justified the cost and complexity of maintaining a sealed bay, of issuing rules to staff, of systematically erasing evidence of its presence? And the more important question, what would happen if I tried to push for answers? That night, I'd made a decision that I knew was probably a mistake, but I was going to make it anyway. I was going to ask, not ask Frank or the day shift supervisor, ask the company directly. I'd wait until morning and call the corporate office. I'd request clarification about Bay 4. I'd cite safety concerns and ask for documentation about what the warehouse actually contained. I'd push for transparency and proper staff notification. But when morning came, I'd found that I couldn't make the call. I'd sat in my apartment, phone in hand, trying to dial the corporate number, but something had stopped me each time. It was as though the closer I got to making the call, the more I understood that calling would be a violation of something unspoken. Not a rule that was written down, not a procedure that was documented, but a rule that was understood by everyone who'd ever worked there. A rule that you could violate once. You could go into Bay 4 after 2 a.m. But if you did that twice, if you pushed harder to understand, if you tried to involve higher authority, if you tried to bring attention to what was being kept in that bay, then the situation would escalate in ways that I couldn't control. Frank had told me that the first time, it would acknowledge me. The second time, it would notice me properly. And I suddenly understood that he hadn't meant that as a threat or a warning about the building's management. He'd meant it as a fact. The thing in Bay 4 had a learning capacity. It was aware of me now. If I pushed harder, if I tried to escalate the situation, if I went back into that bay, it would become more aware. It would focus its attention on me more completely. And I had no idea what that would mean for me. I'd spent the entire day in my apartment, calling in sick to work, sitting with my thoughts. By the time evening came, I'd made a final decision. I was going to keep the job. I was going to follow the rule. I was going to skip Bay 4 after 2 a.m. every single night until the job ended, or I found another position, or the situation resolved itself in some way I couldn't predict. I was going to accept that I worked in a place with an unexplained presence, and I was going to live with that knowledge without pushing for more information. It wasn't a satisfying resolution, but it was the one that kept me safe. When I returned to work the following night, I'd found something waiting for me in my locker. It was a post-it note, just like the one that had originally warned me about Bay 4. But this note had different handwriting. The letters had been formed with mechanical precision, each one exactly the same size and shape, words spaced in a pattern that didn't match normal human writing. The handwriting had been produced by something that understood how to form letters, but didn't have the natural variation that humans produced without effort. The note said, "You understand now. Do not ask again." I'd stared at that note for a long time, my hands trembling, trying to process what it meant. Someone, or something, had accessed my locker during the day. Someone had left me a message. Someone knew that I'd been researching, that I'd accessed the security footage, that I'd been planning to escalate the situation by calling corporate. And they'd decided to warn me off. The note hadn't been left by Frank or the day shift supervisor. It hadn't been left by any human employee that I knew of. It had been left by whatever was in Bay 4. The thing that could move merchandise with too many limbs, that could organize containers according to logic I couldn't comprehend, that could access the security system and erase footage and leave notes in my locker. It had been left by the thing that existed in the sealed bay. The fact that it could leave my locker, that it could move freely through the warehouse during the day, that it could communicate through written language, meant that the situation was far more complex than I'd understood. The thing in Bay 4 wasn't a creature that was kept contained, locked away from the human employees. It was an entity that the company had integrated into their operations. It had purposes that served the company's interests. It had agency and will, and the ability to enforce its own rules. And I had just been warned very directly to stop asking questions. I'd worked there for another 6 weeks after that, a period that felt simultaneously like a few days and like several lifetimes. I'd done my job, completed my inventory checks, and I'd religiously skipped Bay 4 after 2 a.m. I'd never tried to access the security footage again. I'd never tried to call corporate. I'd accepted my paychecks, and I'd tried very hard not to think about what was happening in that sealed bay on the other side of the warehouse, in the hours after midnight when the staff had all gone home, and the facility belonged entirely to the thing that lived in the cold. But I'd been aware of it. Every night, as I approached 2 a.m., I'd felt a kind of tension in the air, a sense of something preparing itself, settling into whatever purpose it served during those sealed hours. A sense of anticipation or hunger or need, something fundamental that manifested as a change in the warehouse's atmosphere. And I'd made sure I was nowhere near Bay 4 when that happened. I'd made sure that my last check of that bay ended well before the cutoff. I'd made sure that I was far away when whatever needed to happen in there at night began to happen. Then, at 6 weeks and 3 days, I'd decided I couldn't do it anymore. I'd walked into Frank's office on my break and told him I was resigning, effective immediately. He'd looked at me with an expression of something like relief, as though he'd been expecting this conversation and was glad that it had finally arrived. "You lasted longer than most," he'd said. And there had been something in his voice that suggested he'd been counting the days, waiting to see how long it would take before my breaking point arrived. "How long?" I'd asked. "How long did the others last?" "The one before you made it about 3 weeks," he'd said. "Before that, we had someone who lasted nearly 2 months. Before that, about 6 weeks. You're toward the long end of the spectrum." "What happens to the people who leave?" I'd asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "They move on," Frank had said. "Find other jobs, get on with their lives, the same thing that happens to anyone who quits a job." But I'd heard something in his voice that suggested it wasn't quite that simple. I had heard the implication that some people didn't move on, that some people got caught in the gravity of what they'd experienced, that some people came back, drawn by curiosity or the need for answers, or the simple fact that they'd never felt as alive as they did when they were operating just at the edge of understanding something terrible. I'd walked out of that warehouse at 12:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and I'd promised myself that I would never go back. That was 4 months ago. I'm writing this now because I've realized something that I've been trying to ignore since I left that warehouse. The thing in Bay 4 left me a note. It communicated with me. It made an effort to ensure I understood that I should stop asking questions. Which means I was never fully outside its attention. Which means that leaving the warehouse didn't sever whatever connection had been established when I walked into Bay 4 at 2:17 a.m. on that Thursday morning. The attention of that thing, once focused on you, doesn't simply dissipate when you change your location. I've been having dreams, recurring dreams where I'm back in the warehouse, and I'm walking toward Bay 4, and I know I shouldn't go in, but I can't seem to stop myself. The dreams have become more vivid, more detailed, more real. In them, I can smell that ozone smell. I can feel the cold of that bay. I can sense something waiting for me in the darkness. In the dreams, the door slides open, and Bay 4 is different. The shelves are empty, the merchandise is gone, and something is waiting for me in the darkness, something that knows me, something that's been waiting patiently for me to come back. Last night I dreamed that I was already inside Bay 4. I was standing in the cold, looking at containers that I knew contained something alive, something aware, something that was trying to communicate with me through the barriers of the containers. And I could understand it in the dream. I could hear what it was saying. It was telling me that I'd made a mistake by leaving. It was telling me that I'd promised, through my initial violation of the rule, to understand what it was. And it was telling me that promises like that don't expire just because you try to walk away. I checked the news yesterday looking for anything about the warehouse, looking for any indication that something was happening there, that the situation was escalating, that I was justified in my anxiety. And I found that the Titan Freight Solutions warehouse had burned down 2 days ago. A massive fire, completely unexplained, that had destroyed the entire facility. The local news report mentioned that, fortunately, the fire had occurred during the day, when there were few staff present. The fire department reported that the cause was still under investigation, but there were early indications of possible electrical failure or arson. One person had been hospitalized, a day shift supervisor named Frank, who had been treated for smoke inhalation and released after a few hours of observation. The news report didn't mention Bay 4. It didn't mention what had been inside the facility. It didn't mention the sealed bay or the special processing or any of the things that might have explained why a warehouse would burn down completely with no apparent cause, no warning, no external trigger. Just a fire that destroyed everything. And I don't think it was because of negligence or accident or electrical failure. I think it was deliberate. I think something in Bay 4 had decided to burn the warehouse down, and I don't think it was because of anger or revenge or any emotion that I could understand. I think it was a statement. I think it was telling me that the game had changed, that by walking away, I'd violated an unspoken agreement, that the thing in Bay 4 had decided to stop maintaining the boundary between its space and the human world, that the rules that had governed the situation had been rewritten. I've started having a new kind of dream. In these dreams, I'm at my apartment, and it's 2:17 a.m., and there's a sound at my door. Just a rustling, just the sound of something trying to get in. And I wake up, gasping, and I check the door, but there's nothing there, just the chain lock, the deadbolt, the safety measures that suddenly seem very thin. But the dreams are becoming more vivid, the sound is becoming more distinct, and I have the terrible certainty that sooner or later, when I wake up from the dream at 2:17 a.m. and I check my door, there's going to be something waiting on the other side. The warehouse is gone, but Bay 4, I suspect, has found new accommodations. And whatever exists in that space, whatever Titan Freight Solutions had been maintaining, is no longer bound by the rules that used to contain it. I never checked what was in Bay 4. I respected the boundary. I followed the rule, eventually. But the rule was designed to protect it from us, I think, not to protect us from it. And now that the rule is gone, now that the warehouse is just ash and rubble, now that the boundaries have been destroyed, I'm waiting for the moment when I'll understand that I should have asked questions when I had the chance. I should have looked closer when I could have looked at all. Because the thing that left me a note knows where I live. It has months of watching me through the warehouse's monitoring systems. It has learned my routines. It has studied my movements. It has understood my weaknesses. And it's had 4 months to figure out exactly what it wants from me. The 2:17 a.m. threshold is getting closer every night, and I'm still awake when it arrives.